Hello, can y'all see and hear me? Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webcast. Our session today is the two E's, the two new E's for water heating. I am Smita Gupta with the NBI, and I'll be your moderator for the session today. And we'll start with this webcast with a few housekeeping announcements first, and then quickly move on to our presentations. First and foremost, thank you all to all of our sponsors and ACEEE ally members for their support of the Hot Water Forum and ACEEE. Please use the chat on the right-hand side of your screen to ask questions of the presenters. As moderator, I'll gather all questions and share for the presenters to answer once all the presentations are complete. If we don't get to your questions, please join us for a 20-minute chat discussion on the Zoom platform immediately following the session. The Zoom link is posted on the audience screen at the very bottom. Please refrain from using the chat for any dialogue other than asking questions. And really appreciate if you can identify the speaker that you're addressing your question to as you write the question. Be sure to check out all the tabs on the left side of the app. From there, you can network with attendees and program participants, visit sponsor pages, and engage in our game to possibly win a free registration to the 2023 Hot Water Forum in Mission Hills, California next year. The resources section includes the program and a list of attendees for downloading. Lastly, we ask everyone to please help in our planning of future hot water forums by completing the conference evaluation. And anyone who completes the evaluation and includes a testimonial will receive a $25 discount off their 2023 Hot Water Forum registrations. All presentations will be available for on-demand viewing to registered attendees on the Socio platform within a few days and will remain available for viewing until May. Presenter slides can be found on their page in the program participants section. And with that, I'd now like to introduce our session and the speakers that we have lined up for you today. So our session today is really dealing with the two E's, but just to give everybody a background, what are the three E's? Energy Emissions and Equity Initiative. This is really coming out of DOE's E3 initiative that accounts for energy emissions and equity. So energy, I think, is one that we've all been working towards and been familiar with for a long time. So we're handling the other two E's in our session today. And don't have to kind of, say the importance of these, given the commitment to climate change and the announcement at COP26, emissions are really a big part of the decarbonization and electrification efforts that are ongoing at an economy-wide level, along with also the fact of being more inclusive in terms of the market transformation efforts to have equity and not the traditional market transformation, which had typically led with early adopters and may not have always included the folks that end up on the other end of the equity spectrum. So getting the clean energy future for everyone is a really big focus. And from what we know and perhaps don't always recognize, that the energy burden is also very related to equity, because this map, as you can see, is for people that live below the federal poverty line. The disproportionate percentage of the income that's an energy burden is a very stark and glaring inequity to be addressing. And with that, the Advanced Water Heating Initiative is one collaborative that is, changing or poised to change the market for water heaters, especially the heat pump water heaters. Started out on the West Coast and is aiming to address all the three E's of the energy emissions and equity equally, with a vision and mission to go to reduce emissions through community-based partners, and promote equity through workforce for all to make efficient heat pump water heaters universal in all applications. And with that, I'll introduce our three panelists for the session today. They are Jim Dennison, who's an associate at RMI, and in the carbon-free buildings team, he works to protect health, improve air quality, and equitable decarbonization. So he will kick us off with his presentation on the emissions at the appliance level, followed by Maggie Molina, who's the branch chief of the state and local climate and energy program at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and provide an overview of the efforts that are getting operationalized and ongoing at EPA and the federal agencies. And then we have Jacob Surfling, who's the co-director and manager of the Building Policy and Technology for the Midwest Building Decarb Coalition that is initiating an equity-first approach to the market transformation in that region. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Jim. Jim?
Hello, thanks so much, Smita, and to everyone who chose to join us for this discussion. I'm Jim Dennison, and I'm an associate at RMI. I'll give an overview of emissions from fossil fuel water heating, as well as their inequitable impacts. This should serve as a helpful background throughout the panel. And then I'll talk about one of the most important policies that we can incorporate in our strategy to eliminate pollution from water heating and from our buildings overall. This is zero emission appliance standards. I'll describe what these are, their benefits, and how we can design them equitably. Here's the high-level summary. First, water heating is a significant source of both greenhouse gases and health-harming pollution. This produces significant health harms, which disproportionately impact communities of color. But fortunately, air agencies like EPA and equivalent state agencies can help eliminate this pollution and drive the development of a market for efficient electric water heating by setting zero emission standards for new appliances. I'll give some examples of states that have proposed these standards and talk about ways to design them for an equitable and affordable transition. In the US, fossil fuel water heating equipment accounts for up to 240 million metric tons of greenhouse gases per year. That's more than the annual emissions from 52 million passenger cars. About 130 million metric tons are the direct emissions from fuel combustion in water heating. That's the yellow portion of the chart, and it represents about 20% of all direct emissions from buildings. Another big source of climate pollution is methane leaks throughout the supply chain, including from water heaters themselves. A team of Stanford researchers found in 2020 that gas water heaters leak methane with a climate impact equivalent to over 7 million metric tons of carbon dioxide each year, much more than has been previously estimated. The same team just published a study making similar findings for gas stoves, which has been getting a lot of attention lately. These supply chain methane leaks attributable to gas water heaters are represented by the green bars on the right of the chart. The dark green is RMI's low-end estimate, and the light green is our high-end estimate. Nitrogen oxides are another type of pollution from fossil fuel water heaters that many people are less familiar with. NOx is a health-harming pollutant that's regulated under the Clean Air Act, and once it's released to the atmosphere, it forms ground-level ozone and particulate matter. These are maybe the two pollutants of greatest concern from an air quality, health, and regulatory perspective. Nationwide, gas appliances emit over twice as much NOx as gas power plants, even though they only burn about 80% as much gas overall. And in some areas, appliances have an even more outsized contribution to NOx emissions. Water heating is a major contributor to these emissions. The yellow part of the right-hand bubble shows that gas water heaters directly emit 77,000 tons of NOx each year. That's over half the emissions from gas power plants. These nitrogen oxides and other pollution from fossil fuel appliances cause really serious health harms. These harms include about 6,000 premature deaths per year, according to estimates by Harvard public health researchers. I do want to flag that the values shown here are the health harms from all appliance pollution, not just those from water heating. It's harder to separate out the health impacts specifically from water heating, but it's definitely fair to assume that they're significant given water heaters' large contributions to emissions overall. And as shown in this chart, the pollution exposure and health harms from appliance pollution fall disproportionately on people of color. A recent peer-reviewed study found that people of color are exposed to nearly twice as much outdoor particle pollution formed by residential gas appliances as whites. This was the highest percent disparity seen in any of the 14 source categories studied, higher than vehicles, power plants, and industrial pollution. The chart shows that people of color experienced 41% higher exposure than the national average, which is in that top bar. Asian Americans' exposure was nearly twice the national average and over 2.5 times as high as white Americans' exposure on average. This is just one example of the inequitable impacts of appliance pollution. An RMI report found similar disparities, including high levels of appliance pollution in historically redlined areas. As I mentioned at the start, air agencies like EPA can play a key role in helping eliminate the harms from appliance pollution by setting zero emission standards for new appliances. These standards would work by requiring all new equipment sales, or an increasing percentage of them, to be pollution free. This is similar to the structure of the zero emission vehicle standards that have been developed by California and implemented by 13 states. Air agencies have clear authority to set these standards, and in fact, Utah, Texas, and much of California have had low NOx water heater standards on the books for years. Recently, California, New York, and New Jersey have proposed zero emission standards for some or all space and water heating equipment. One of the main advantages of zero emission standards is that they give clear market signals that can drive cost-saving innovation and investments of the kind that we've heard about in the plenary and other panels in this forum. This is especially true when zero emission standards are combined with initiatives like contractor training, consumer engagement, upstream and midstream incentives, and financing programs, again, like we've been hearing about throughout the forum. Standards can be designed to phase in thoughtfully so that we can balance the lead time needed to ramp up equipment production with the fast action needed to meet health and climate goals. I won't get into all the details of standard design now, but I do want to flag that standards can and should be designed to advance an equitable transition. Air agencies should develop standards in collaboration with stakeholders like manufacturers, installers, utilities, and most importantly, impacted communities. And a key strategy for ensuring that zero emission standards support key companion policies, particularly those that are going to focus on making the transition equitable, that's to determine upfront what conditions will be needed for an equitable transition, and then commit to evaluating progress toward those conditions before the standards are fully implemented. Again, this approach has an analog in the vehicles context, where California's zero emission vehicle standards, as well as EPA's overall vehicle emission standards, used an approach called a midterm evaluation or interim evaluation, where the agencies, in enacting the standards, committed upfront to doing a comprehensive assessment of the standards before they had been fully implemented, to assess how market development was going, whether we were on track to being able to meet them. I think a really key thing to incorporate into these interim standards in the case of appliance standards is to really focus on the conditions of an equitable transition. Not just making sure that we'll be able to transition the market overall, but being sure that we'll be able to do it in a way that's affordable for low-income folks, doesn't risk displacement of renters, and satisfies other conditions, which we suggest some in the report and are definitely eager to continue engaging with folks in developing these ideas about how to set standards up. Thanks so much, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and reactions in the Q&A. Now we'll hear from Maggie with EPA.
Great. Thank you, Jim. And just a reminder to folks to please go ahead and enter any questions that you have into the chat box. So thank you to Smita for organizing this panel, and to ACEEE and my fellow panelists. It's always great to be here with the ACEEE community. So I lead EPA's state and local climate and energy program. We are a non-regulatory partnership program that serves as a resource to state, local, and tribal governments to help them meet their climate, energy, and equity goals. And on equity, we're certainly seeing increased interest from our stakeholders in equitable policy design across the board for climate and clean energy. And certainly at EPA, we've consistently heard from Administrator Regan the importance of lifting up overburdened and underserved communities while creating that 21st century clean energy economy, and really approaching all of our work through the lens of environmental justice. So it's great to be here to talk with you about some of the federal initiatives, some specific resources that EPA has put out on environmental justice and energy equity, and some state examples as well. So the state and local program that I oversee is in the Climate Protection Partnerships division of the US EPA, the same division that brings the Energy Star program, as well as other partnership programs. And I know my colleagues in the Energy Star program are speaking throughout the conference here as well. So let me start with the federal landscape, a few state policy examples, and then wrap up. I will make sure to save enough time to get to some specific program examples here at EPA and some of the resources that we have. So first, we've seen efforts by the Biden administration to prioritize climate, environmental justice, and economic recovery, and to do that through integrated ways and to work across the federal government. So a couple of examples to highlight here. First, the executive order advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. This is to strengthen the federal workforce by promoting diversity, equality, inclusion, and accessibility. That executive order also has some kind of key definitions that I thought might be of interest for folks to know, key definitions on underserved communities and equity. That is used, those definitions are used in other executive orders as well. The next one there is tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. This order creates the Justice 40 initiative, which I'm sure folks have heard about. Justice 40 is a whole of government effort to ensure federal agencies work to deliver at least 40% of the overall benefits from federal investments in both climate and clean energy go to disadvantaged communities. So last summer, the administration released interim guidance as a key step in the Justice 40 initiative process. That interim guidance also launches the Justice 40 pilot, which identified 21 priority programs. At EPA, some of the examples of programs in the pilot are the Drinking Water and Clean Water State Revolving Funds, the Brownfields Program, and the Diesel Emissions Reduction Act program, or DERA, among others. But just to be clear, the Climate Protection Partnership Division doesn't have any specific pilots, but I thought might be useful to hear some of the types of programs at EPA, at least, that are in the Justice 40 pilot. And then, of course, other agencies will have their own pilots. Another recent effort, the White House released a beta version of a new climate and economic justice screening tool, which is designed to help agencies identify disadvantaged, marginalized, and underserved communities for purposes of the Justice 40 initiative. So that tool is available now. I've included the link here for review and comment. But overall, I'm kind of just taking a step back on Justice 40. I would just say I think it sends a strong marker to all of us working on climate and clean energy on what to be striving to achieve in our work in the energy efficiency sector. So kind of that's federal initiatives broadly. Back to specific technical resources from EPA specifically. Broadly speaking, we know that minority and low-income populations have borne a disproportionate impact to pollution, and Jim highlighted some of those disparities and specific to water heating too. But broadly speaking, that research has been very clear, and we now know that climate change similarly impacts some more than others. And we saw this in a new report EPA published last fall, Climate Change and Social Vulnerability in the United States, a focus on 6 impacts. This is the first EPA study to look at how climate impacts are distributed across populations based on income, education, race, and ethnicity, as well as age. So that study highlights those disproportionate unequal risks that climate change is projected to have on communities that are least able to anticipate, cope with, and recover from those adverse impacts. The impacts include air quality health impacts, extreme temperature impacts on health and labor, and different types of flooding impacts on traffic and property. I list EJ Screen, the environmental justice screening and mapping tool, here next. That's been around several years, just recently released some updates. It's a mapping and screening tool that includes more than 10 environmental indicators, demographic indicators, and then more than 10 EJ indexes, which combine different demographic indicators into a single environmental indicator. A fairly new tool is the EPA Power Plants and Neighboring Communities mapping tool. That one might be of interest to check out, that combines power plant data with EIA data and EJ Screen data. And then next, the Energy Savings Impact and Scenario tool, which is the one that all the ones I mentioned up to this point are not out of my team. Other colleagues across the agency have worked on those, but the Energy Savings and Impact Scenario tool, this one here, my team just launched last December. So let me circle back to that in just a little bit. But before I do that, let me switch gears and share some state policy examples. As I said, we do state and local policy work, and in that work, we've seen a lot of exciting policy efforts at the state level to better embed equity considerations in climate and energy policy. So here's some examples of policies we're seeing at the state level. We're seeing statewide goals. And many of these have really great energy efficiency policy examples as well. Many of these are very broad climate policies, but there are very specific efficiency provisions as well. So for example, dedicated goals or targets requiring certain level investments for disadvantaged communities or aiming to reduce energy burdens. We've certainly seen this in energy efficiency portfolios. And this one's been around for years, of states setting specific investment or maybe savings thresholds for income qualified programs. We've also seen establishment of environmental equity offices and advisory councils. We looked at this last year and found almost 20 states had established state environmental equity offices or programs, and about 15 states have environmental equity advisory council commissions or boards. And then more broadly on stakeholder engagement, not just through kind of an agency level or agency established advisory council, but ensuring meaningful stakeholder engagement and advisory groups to really enable full and active representation from communities all the way from the design to implementation of policies. Reforming cost benefit analysis, we certainly talk about this a lot in energy efficiency, and there's a lot of work going on now to ensure full benefits are included in these types of tests, sometimes exempting certain programs from cost benefit analysis. Tackling barriers to participation, for example, health and safety barriers that may otherwise prevent households from participating in energy efficiency programs. And then workforce development programs, again, that broadly speaking on climate, we're seeing good examples of this, but energy efficiency examples as well. So here are just a few examples of broad climate, state climate, and clean energy policies that have addressed energy equity and environmental justice. The California Cap and Trade program, where disadvantaged communities are targeted for investments of those proceeds, where 35% of revenues are required to environmentally disadvantaged and low-income communities. The New York Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act is another example. It requires disadvantaged communities to receive a minimum of 35% of the benefits from state spending on efficiency and clean energy. In Massachusetts, the act creating a next generation roadmap. This act defines environmental justice and environmental burdens, expands the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act review to require an environmental impact report. Again, I don't have time to go through all of the details. I want to save time to get to the last piece, but just these are all great examples with a lot of specific equity and environmental justice provisions. And then Illinois Climate and Equitable Jobs Act is yet another one. I mentioned the health and safety aspect earlier as a barrier to participation. The Illinois Act is an example of a state that has tried to address this and had a kind of specific provision that required utilities to implement a health and safety fund of at least 15% of the low-income weatherization budget for health and safety. That's one of many things in that bill, just to pull out a couple of specific examples here. Okay, so let me go to my third topic, and that's kind of programmatic and resources at EPA. This is just a snapshot. Obviously don't have time to go through all of these, but of the resources my team at the state and local program provides on emissions and health benefits, as Smita said, we wanted to hit on both the E of emissions and E of equity, and a couple of tools to point your attention to our avoided emissions and generation tool. That's an 8760 model of the power sector. You can model efficiency impacts on emissions. And then our new one, I said I would come back to this, ESIS, the Energy Savings and Impact Scenario Tool. We just launched this last winter, and this tool goes out to 2040 and it allows you to do scenarios of energy efficiency programs. It's not at the end use level. So, for folks here interested in water heating, it's not going to go down to that level of detail. But I do think it would be of interest to folks if you're looking to analyze electricity savings costs, and then those multiple benefits across emissions and equity, because there's an energy burdens module specifically. This could be a whole presentation in of itself to go over what's in that tool, but just to check it out if you're interested in digging in on energy burdens analysis. We pull in DOE's lead data, and it's a good kind of aggregator of various data sets. Oh, sorry about that. Oh, I clicked on the link instead of going to my next slide. Okay, there we go. So to wrap up with some examples from the Energy Star program, some things my colleagues are doing to reach low to moderate income and underserved customers. First, just broadly, we're working on targeted outreach using customer segmentation and campaigns to instill trust and better inform LMI audiences about the value of energy efficiency and focusing them on kind of key product categories. We have a best value finder tool that lets folks look at specific products, resources for small businesses, and then the Energy Star Home Upgrade, which Abby Dakin this morning talked about. So I'll just kind of keep going here. One thing about Home Upgrade, though, that I wanted to mention is we're working on ensuring that Home Upgrade is available to a broad group of customers, including households, including LMI households, and seeking inclusive utility investment opportunities to reach as many households as possible. And then finally, kind of coming full circle here back to water heating specifically, we're looking at program design considerations for reaching underserved communities. Specification development, for example, the recent 4.0 heat pump water heater specification added product types appropriate for multifamily applications. And then more broadly, we're working with stakeholders and market participants to better understand and overcome those key barriers. We know, affordability is going to be a key barrier, addressing those high upfront costs and lack of access to capital, addressing limited awareness by both customers and contractors, and then working to promote best practices and innovations where we can. and state and utility programs that are out there in the field delivering efficiency to customers. So this could be through point of sale rebates, leveraging both those and rebates at midstream and wholesale. Can we package these various rebates to address that high upfront cost hurdle? Working on financing options that are low or no risk to customers. Bulk purchase programs are another example. My colleague mentioned the Efficiency Maine has a low-income water heating program that uses the bulk purchase approach to bring down those first cost per product and ensure availability, and also to package that up with weatherization measures as well. And then broadly increase marketing and outreach across multiple channels and leveraging co-branding for both manufacturers and utility or program administrators. So I tried to cover a lot in my time here. Hope that was helpful to you all. And reminder to put your questions in the chat, and I will turn it over next to Jacob.
All right. Thank you, Maggie. I'll put down my pen and stop furiously trying to take notes on what you were saying. It's been said before, my name is Jacob Surfling. I'm one of the co-directors of the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition. For the past year or so, we have been collaborating with NBI on a regional spinoff of their Advanced Water Heater Initiative, appropriately enough named the Midwest Advanced Water Heater Initiative. And as mentioned at the top, we've been trying to take a more explicitly equity-focused approach to Midwest OWI. And so I'm going to talk briefly about some of the lessons and initial takeaways we've had from that process as we've gotten underway. Just a little bit about the coalition here as we get started. We were founded in 2019 with the mission to develop and implement equitable strategies to achieve zero emissions from the Midwestern building sector by 2050. So with kind of an initial idea of organizing some of these state and local players across that 8-state region so that we weren't reinventing the wheel on what had already been successful in terms of building policy in other states across the region, recognizing that we all had a lot of common issues to overcome in terms of cold climate and politics and things of that nature. I actually joined in my role last fall, and this was in the midst of Midwest BDC being in the process of kind of taking a step back after our initial launch, after being challenged by our coalition members on how well we were tackling that equitable word in our mission statement and how we could better incorporate that into both how we operated as a coalition and also what types of policies we were advocating for across the region. So one of our first steps was the adoption of the Jemez principles as sort of a guiding light for how we were going to do things moving forward. And if you're not familiar with them, there are 6. Number 1 being be inclusive. Number 2, an emphasis on bottom-up organizing. Number 3, let people speak for themselves. Number 4, work together in solidarity and mutuality. Number 5, build just relationships among ourselves. And number 6, a commitment to self-transformation. So obviously there are different approaches that you could take as an organization to incorporate those values. Some of the ways that we've gone about that with Midwest BDC, first off, we made the decision that 40% of our annual budget was going to be dedicated to participation stipends and empowerment grants. And that number was kind of chosen to be in line with things like the Federal Justice 40 commitment, in the Nonprofit Climate Fund Justice Funders Pledge. We completed our first round of that regranting program over the course of November 2021 and January 2022 with 40 stipends, and those are aimed at individuals or organizations who otherwise wouldn't be able to participate in coalition activities. And then 8 larger project grants that were intended to jumpstart pilot projects that individual coalition members were trying to jumpstart in their communities. So electrification projects and things of that nature. In addition to myself, earlier in 2021, they also brought on my colleague and co-director, Marnice Jackson, to serve as our manager of community engagement and outreach, with the task of intentionally focusing on outreach to environmental justice and BIPOC-led organizations across the region. And that has included some smaller community-based organizations that did not have building decarbonization as their main issue previously, but they've really brought in a unique perspective to the work that we're doing and insights into their communities, and have really jumped at the chance to link up the issues around building decarbonization with their other areas of focus. We also engaged in a year-long consensus priorities drafting and adoption process. So this began with 3 sessions in which coalition members were able to uplift priorities they would like to see the coalition proceed with, followed by a process where staff tried to synthesize that larger list into some more concrete bullet points, a second redrafting process, and then finally a full consensus vote. So that was a long process and a difficult one at times, but I think a fruitful one in terms of understanding what the real priorities were of the communities we were seeking to serve. And it's already kind of proved dividends in terms of guiding staff's work in terms of what our focuses are in 2022. And then finally, we had our first annual Midwest BDC Equity Summit in November of 2021. That was a 3-day virtual summit that had 16 different workshops focused on equity, both in terms of how the coalition operated and equity issues in the building decarbonization space in general. So how has that impacted how our partnership with MBI on Midwest Advanced Water Heater Initiative has evolved? We carried over that intentional recruitment approach to the steering committee that we formed to guide the work that myself and my counterparts at MBI were undertaking, making sure that we brought in environmental justice voices across the region. And I should point out that 4 of our steering committee members were part of that initial group of 40 participation stipends that we awarded this fall. So we've really tried to make a commitment to enabling them to have real active input on our research and advocacy activities around market transformation for heat pump water heaters. Because of how we recruited to the steering committee and knowing that we were going to have folks involved in this process that were not familiar with water heater issues or building science issues or heat pump water heaters, we knew that we were going to have to go slow in the early goings of our steering committee. So our first couple meetings in the fall were really based around relationship building and having conversations around what their perception of water heater was, how they saw that intersecting with other issues that they were working on in their communities. So you can see here a screenshot of a Jamboard, which is a free group collaboration tool that Google has. Really just kind of actively taking notes during that process and letting everybody just kind of brainstorm their thoughts before we moved into a more concrete work plan with that process. So as we had those conversations, some main themes did emerge and they kind of fell into three main areas. One that became apparent right away was a focus on renters, which are a huge chunk of households across the region and nationally, and really talking about their lack of decision-making power in terms of what equipment and appliances are serving their homes, and then their ability or lack thereof to access existing incentive programs that may be offered through utilities in the states, but again, not being the main property owner, were they really able to take advantage of that programming? The second main bucket was around jobs and business development that may result from any market transformation activities around heat pump water heaters. They noted that there would need to be added assistance for underrepresented groups looking to take advantage of the job opportunities created by transitioning to heat pump water heaters. And there was a major focus on, yes, we want programs targeted to bring emissions and energy benefits into our communities, but we also want to make sure that the economic benefits of the business opportunities created by transitioning to heat pump water heaters are kept in our communities as well. And then the final area of focus was affordability, both in terms of the upfront costs of the equipment and any other work that may be required to get it installed, but also protections against negative impacts on energy burden. And as you may recall from the map that Smita put up earlier in the session, regionally, that is a major issue in the Midwest, even compared to other parts of the country. So from those main themes, we're early in our work, but I think we've identified some major areas of need with equitably decarbonizing hot water. The first is the need for more holistic heat pump water heater incentive programs. So recognizing that traditionally energy efficiency programs and the like around water heaters have really focused just on paying down the cost of a higher efficiency piece of equipment. But if you're dealing with households that have other issues that need to be addressed in terms of the electrical service or the plumbing of the household, to make that replacement project feasible, and the program you're not eligible to use the funds to pay for those types of things, or there's just not enough financial assistance provided to cover some of those things, it effectively makes it a program that's unusable to those folks. Also, the idea of coupling a heat pump water heater replacement with other weatherization or energy efficiency measures that may mitigate some of those energy burden concerns that we talked about before. Also recognizing the need for more all-electric rates to be provided from utilities for households transitioning to electric water heating or electric space heating, but also the need for outreach and educational assistance for folks making that transition, so that they know that those types of rates are available, and understanding the process of switching over to those options and understanding the different impacts that that decision may have. In terms of workforce development, we see the need for wraparound support for field entrants from underserved communities. So recognizing that, if you're going to be creating jobs and want the benefit of that job creation to be seen equitably, it can't necessarily end at providing training scholarships. There may be a need for other mentorship for folks, especially if they're going to be, racially or otherwise demographically different from everybody else in a training program. They may need that additional outside mentorship. They may need additional assistance accessing hands-on training opportunities, and they will likely need some sort of guarantee or protection that participation in those training programs is actually going to lead to employment opportunities or career advancement. Getting back to that concern over where the economic benefits of transitioning to heat pump water heaters would accrue, we do see the need for intentional recruitment of BIPOC and community-based program partners in terms of implementers and contractors who may actually be taking advantage of the business opportunities that a heat pump water heater program would create. And then finally, the need for renter-focused policy at the state and local level to address that issue of split incentives between the property owners and the renters. I know that ACEEE recently put out a dashboard showing states and municipalities that did have renter-focused policies out there, doing things like requiring energy disclosure on leases and things like that. But you'll see that it's pretty sparse, and we need more and able to encourage that to be more accessible to folks. So I'm going to stop off there and see what we have for questions here in the chat from everybody.
Thank you to all of our panelists for wonderful presentations to cover our 2 new E's, as we call it, of the 3E initiative. I'd encourage all audience to please type in your questions and addressing it to the specific panelists. We have at least 2 questions that I'll start off with, and then please, audience, continue typing more. Question for you, Jim, that came in is, where and when do you expect the first zero emission standards for appliances to be implemented?
Yeah, well, we've seen a lot of exciting developments really across the country in recent months. New Jersey has already proposed what would effectively be zero emission standards for larger commercial boilers, 1 to 5 million BTU boilers. And their decarbonization planning indicates that that will be followed by other building electrification measures, hopefully to include additional zero emission standards. The Bay Area Air Quality Management District in California is perhaps the next closest along. They've been in the process of developing zero emission standards for both space and water heating that are going to go before the board for a vote this year, probably this summer. And the water heating provisions would be enacted in 2027 for smaller water heaters, and then 2031 for large water heaters and boilers. I'll also note that the Bay Area District has included a provision for an interim review of the kind that I described in my presentation, although we would certainly like to see it even more explicitly focused on ensuring an equitable transition. And then finally, I'll just mention that the California Air Resources Board has indicated in their state implementation planning strategy, which relates to non-attainment of air quality standards throughout the state. They've indicated that one of the measures they plan to pursue is a zero emission standard for space and water heating that would be developed by 2025 and take full effect by 2030.
Thank you, Jim. That's the really big one that we're all kind of waiting for. The CARB emission standard that can take into effect. It really would be a huge deal. I'll just go in order of the questions. Thank you, audience. Keep the questions coming. The next one is for Jacob. Can you say more about the clean water connection?
Yeah, so I am assuming that this is referencing the Post-it notes that we had on the Jamboard that I screenshotted. But I think that is a kind of a good example of why it's valuable to really put in the effort to make sure that folks do have a chance to speak for themselves in that type of forum when you're crafting a program, because myself and Amy from MBI, who are leading this Midwest Awe Initiative, both came from energy efficiency backgrounds. And so I think we have a very specific viewpoint of where we see things like heat pump water heaters, which is, it's replacing a piece of equipment. And you think about the emissions and the kWh and the natural gas therms reductions. And that's sort of like where you begin and end to see it as an issue. And the folks on our steering committee really much more saw that inherently related to things like lead pipe remediation or issues with water quality coming into their homes. So it's just an interesting contrast in terms of where they placed water heaters in the realms of concerns that they had for households. And that's part of what we get at when we're talking about that there may be a more holistic approach needed in terms of how water heater programs are offered to really directly address the concerns as those communities see them.
Thanks. And while we're on you, there's another question about the ACEEE report that you referenced. And if you can provide, I don't know if there is a website you can call out to, or perhaps somebody can provide that. I know we're not enabled to directly interact with the chat. So
I should have had the link at my fingertips when I was going to mention that, but I think if you do just search for ACEEE renter policy dashboard, you should find it. And it's a map that kind of shows different cities across the US and states that have passed some sort of renter-specific energy efficiency policy. But in most cases, they kind of begin and end, as far as I've seen, with that energy disclosure element of, they have to either give you a comparative energy benchmark for the building or disclose, a previous year's worth of energy bills for the unit, which is helpful, I guess, in terms of putting a little bit of pressure on landlords to make improvements to their properties, to make them competitive with the rest of the market, but I don't know that I've seen anything that really directly gets at the issue of, especially around water heaters, renters being able to directly make those improvements to their homes. I don't know if Jim or Maggie are aware of something nationally that I'm not.
Well, in addition to the dashboard by ACEEE that you mentioned, ACEEE also has a number of reports just on best practices and multifamily energy efficiency program design. And I see one of the questions is about examples of programs to address split incentives. And, I don't think there's any silver bullet, but some of those are, one specific example that comes to mind. But I do think of having been at ACEEE in my prior life, did a lot of research on program best practices to address those split incentives, everything from working upstream, with the manufacturers and distributors, kind of almost outside of that direct challenge of the split incentive, but then working along the chain, ever from the resident outreach and education to working with property management, and then upstream. But I don't know if others have got any specific examples that come to mind.
One thing I might just mention, one of the advantages of appliance pollution standards approach is that if standards apply to all or to a large majority of the market, they're going to bring the whole market along to efficient electric appliances, which is ultimately where we need to go as a society. And that has the advantage of being very inclusive. It gives everyone an opportunity to share in the benefits of electrification because the whole market moves that way. Of course, the flip side of that is that we need to be thoughtful about how we can overcome obstacles that apply to a whole variety of situations and make sure that as everyone comes along in the transition, they're all being given the support that different folks need.
Yeah, in fact, that was going to be one of my questions to both you, Jim and Maggie. Is like, do you think that the emission standards will kind of lead the way towards this transition rather than the traditionally, the efficiency or the energy standards? Like, will the emission standards kind of be the leader in making this transition towards electrification and decarbonization?
Yeah, I mean, I think with all things energy policy and climate policies, we need a lot of various tools, and states will experiment with different ones. It'll be helpful to see how these, state standards are kind of leading the way from the emission standard approach, how those play out. And other states, I'm sure, will be watching and following along. But then in other states that likely will not be their kind of leading choice, and other tools will be needed. So yeah, it's a great question. I don't have a crystal ball to predict how that will play out.
What does your crystal ball say, Jim?
Well, I guess the thing I might add is just that it's important to design all of the policies that we're using to drive the electrification transition to work well together. And that definitely includes appliance pollution standards. Those can do a tremendous job of driving a market shift, as we've seen in a lot of other contexts, whether it's renewable portfolio standards for electricity, electric vehicle standards, as well as phasing out ozone depleting chlorofluorocarbons. So there are a lot of good examples of ways that pollution standards can drive the market transition and help us achieve healthier and more climate friendly outcomes. But that's not necessarily going to ensure that the equipment that we're installing is the most efficient. That's more of a job for DOE and their standards. And so it's gonna take all the policies working together in tandem.
Absolutely. I saw another question come up about the program and split incentives. Anybody on the panel have view of outside the US programs to address split incentive? Aware of any international efforts that have perhaps sought to address this split incentive question? All right, I think we'll table that one for now.
You stumped us.
Yeah.
The one that I might mention, again, I know I sound like a broken record just talking about emission standards, but that's what I know the best. But some European countries have already been moving forward with standards, and the European Union recently was considering European Union-wide standards. They didn't end up going that far, but took some steps to facilitate and enable national level standards, which, to the extent that those move the whole market, they can help address split incentive issues.
Right. So we have a question here, which is, I think, more of a comment, but perhaps in terms of addressing market transformation and market, the barriers towards market transformation for water heating, I'd say you have, by some respects, the 3 A's: the awareness, affordability, and availability. And equity and emissions really addresses very directly the two, the awareness, which is around education and training. So how do each of you see that play out in terms of the emissions and equity focus, the awareness part of it? What is the awareness aspect of emissions and equity? Any of you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question. And I think kind of going back to, I think it was Jacob talking about really listening to the needs of, communities, and really intentional listening. I think that's an important place to start with awareness, because I think the messenger matters just as much as the message. So I think it's helpful if we're thinking about awareness, to start from a place of who are those trusted local messengers, who is working to support this market transformation effort. We need kind of all hands on deck from EPA's Energy Star program, kind of do broad messaging, to the regional collaborations and regional entities working on workforce development programs, to the direct program administrators and the community-based organizations and their involvement and support for raising awareness. So it's a great question, and my mind just swirls on all of the actors and groups that we need raising awareness.
So I think we're at time on this platform, and we are set up to transition to the Zoom platform for a more interactive continuation of this conversation. So I want to invite all the audience. Please use the link that's posted as the first thing in the chat. It's a Zoom platform with the meeting ID and the passcode. Please, let's take a few minutes to transition to that platform. Our panelists and I will meet you there shortly.
Thanks, everyone.